Yeah, as you just said, we can't really keep track all the time of these hidden motivations because otherwise it would be really painful and slow for us to act, right? And also, on the other end, there's this question about the self, that is, we need to have this sort of lifelong narrative about ourselves to be mentally healthy. And I mean,
Right.
it's not really it would not
Right.
really be possible to keep it coherent if we were to be aware of these hidden motives all the time, right?
Well, we could easily imagine creatures who are able to be aware of their motives. I mean, that's the creature we imagine ourselves, in fact, to be until you read our book, right?
Yeah.
So it's not a crazy kind of creature to have exist. It's just not who you are. And because you are this weird creature you didn't realize you are in fact not very capable of that. But it would be quite capable for such creatures to exist, who are just honest about their motives and did what they thought they were doing. So we've been talking about what you shouldn't try to do with the book, or what doesn't seem very promising. What to us would seem the most obvious promising thing to do, especially to me, is to continue our work here. We go over 10 areas, but you could easily imagine another 20 or 30 areas where you could also try to look for hidden motives. There should be a lot more hidden motives elsewhere in our lives. And we've shown a structure about how to do that. It's not complicated per se. It's not high tech, at least. It's just, a matter of detail. In each area, like, collect a bunch of possible motives, write down a bunch of things that could plausibly be going on, and then collect a bunch of detail about what's actually happening there, especially puzzles with respect to the usual story, and then do the matching. And that's the sort of thing one should be able to do in a lot of areas. So if you were a policy analyst or a social scientist for whom your focus was understanding the social world, we think that would be tempting to you. We've shown you there's this huge set of things that people are missing, where they're just really wrong about things that matter a lot, and shown you a way to find a lot more of them. And if this was your specialty, wouldn't you be excited by that? Wouldn't you be eager to go find more hidden motives? And I have to say, almost no one has this reaction to our book. Mm-hmm. We have really not heard from anyone who said, yeah, I'm going to go look for some more hidden motives. A lot of people agonize about their own hidden motives. A lot of people go into, well, what could I really think about my motives? Some of them will go into, you can't really be right, or you haven't shown it accurately enough. And some people say, yeah, I guess that's how humans are. Isn't that interesting? And almost no one is interested in taking it further. Mm-hmm. That seems to say something interesting to me.
Yeah, and another thing, at least, that I picked up from your book, and please correct me if this is wrong, a conclusion of it all is that we can still act toward our own self-interest, but in more positive ways. That is, for example, I think that a good example, again, is about charity, because we can still be charitable people and be empathic people and obtain all the positive social benefits from showing off to other people that we're charitable, but at the same time trying to direct our resources to better ends and to try to help more people than we would be helping otherwise.
Well, I wouldn't say you won't pay any cost. I might say you could realize the costs are mild, and so you might be willing to pay the cost. So, in fact, it looks like ordinary people do think less of effective altruists. They think they are less compassionate, and they give them less credit for their charity from the point of view of what they care about. But it's not a lot. So you could be willing to pay that price for some other benefits. I mean, you can show off by being an effective altruism how clever you are, how intellectually consistent you are, how principled you are, how willing you are to do, conscientious and careful you are. Those are all positive features you can show off by being an effective altruist, even if people will not actually see you as empathetic. Similarly, say in medicine, right? if usually you would go to the doctor and you'd just be really worried about like whether you're doing it right and whether they're going to find it because, hey, you might die. And you realize, you know, people go to the doctor more or less, it doesn't really make much difference. Well, now you can like not worry about it so much. I mean, yeah, you might die, but agonizing over the doctor isn't going to help much. So, you know, and similarly, like for pushing somebody else to go to the doctor, you might feel guilty you didn't push them to go more. What if they die? But now you might realize, well, they might die, but it won't be your fault. They might not think you love them if you don't push them to go to the doctor, and you should worry about whether they know you love them. But if you have some other ways to show them, maybe you shouldn't worry so much about this one way. And so once you realize the agenda, a lot of these things to show off, you might start to just reassess and say, well, who thinks how much of me? And who are the people I want to impress who aren't as impressed enough yet? And then what are the things that would really impress them? And you could like think that through and come up with something more focused, rather than just doing all these things that are just designed in the abstract to impress people but aren't very coherent and organized and may not be well suited to whatever it is you've got that you could show off.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and another aspect I think is that when we learn that we operate on the basis of these hidden motives, on the one hand, we could get very cynical about humanity in general, but on the other hand, it's also true that if we are aware of the fact that even if we are highly intellectual people or something like that, we are also victims, let's say, of these hidden motivations, and we also share these flaws with other people, it's also easier for us to turn into more humble people.
Right, so usually we're afraid of looking bad because most people presume that most people are good, and if you admit to being bad, you look much worse than most people. Yeah. Once you know that most people are in the middle between good and bad, and you're not really any different for them, you're admitting you're bad in a certain way isn't showing you're worse than most people, even though it might give somebody ammunition to make an accusation about you. And of course, you know, you could be a bit better than most people on some ways at least, and still not be anywhere near the ideal that you might have thought you were. But not everybody's exactly in the middle. So presumably some people are more idealistic about some things, and you could be one of those people who's more idealistic than some people about other things. So I might say credibly believe I'm more idealistic about being an intellectual than most intellectuals. And I might have credibly proven that through my research agenda and my topics and what opportunities I've given up and what I've pursued. I might think, well, I've got credible evidence that I am more than most people trying to figure out what's true and tell people about it, even when it doesn't, you know, show off my abilities or say things people want to hear. I might be able to say, well, look, I am this. But of course, that doesn't mean I'm anything close to the ideal of intellectual that I might have had or other people might have had when I was younger. I'm nowhere near that ideal. I just might be closer than other people. And so you have to ask yourself, how comforting are you willing to accept that, you know, when you look at it carefully. Now, of course, on other parameters, I might be worse than other people. You know, there's a whole bunch of dimensions of life. And on some, I'm better and more idealistic than others, and on others, I'm worse. That's going to if you're going to be realistic and look at, I mean, most people, when they look at themselves realistically, are going to have to see they're mostly near the middle, and they're going to be better on some parameters and worse on others. And you could look at that and say, well, am I okay with that? Do I think the parameter I'm better on is more important to me? Mm-hmm. And of course, you can always try to do better. Of course, if you want to, you can always, whenever you see a difference between your ideals and your actuality, there's two main strategies available to you. One is to try to reaffirm your, you know, plan to be better, to devote yourself more strongly to your ideals, and that's possible to some degree. And the other is to decide your ideals were not realistic ideals or good ideals, and, you know, pull back on them. We often do that with many kinds of ideals. There are many kinds of ideals that kids have about what adults should be like that adults go, that's a crazy ideal. That would be stupid. You know, that's not at all feasible, and that's not at all even desirable. So those are the, you know, two main categories of responses: lower your ideals or raise your behavior. But again, I'm not so interested in that. I mean, maybe that's a failing of mine, but that's again using the book as a self-help book. And I'm more of a social scientist here. I'm saying we social scientists and policy analysts have to have a view of the world in order to figure out what policies to recommend or change. And if our view is just wrong, we're going to be getting that wrong. So it seems to me this is saying that we have an enormous potential compared to what we have had at doing better once we understand what's really going on. Now, maybe, of course, part of it, though, is that people don't actually want reform as much as we thought they did. So when you think of people as idealistic in the way they claim to be, and they claim that they want to help the world and they want a better world, and so they claim that all that it would take to make a better world is for you to be able to show them how to make a better world. And then you think, well, what we social scientists need to do is search in the space of how to make things better and find something and then show it to people, and then they'll adopt it, and that will make a better world. And if it turns out that social scientists and policy people are not actually trying to make a better world, they're mostly just trying to show off, then it might turn out that you could do the research and figure out how to make the better world and show it to everybody, and they still won't care. They might just not want to do it because it doesn't make them look good. In which case, you might be able to figure out how to make the world better and not get anybody to do it.
Yeah, and perhaps this next one is a sort of an unfair question. I'm not sure, but would there be any way, because of all of the things we talked about here today, to try to strike a balance between relying on our hidden motives, because as we already talked about here, we don't really want to exclude all of them, otherwise we wouldn't be able to operate normally in the world if we were trying to only perform according to conscious motives, let's say. And so, for example, another of the things that you talk about in the book is the cues that we get from other people according to their body language. And I mean, most of them, at least, are true and are reliable. But on the other end, and talking perhaps about stereotypes, you can also be looking at other people according to some superficial traits like their skin color, and it wouldn't really lead to good results neither for them nor perhaps for you. So I mean, this is a very complicated question, but is there...
It's pretty simple, I think, actually. The two key things to keep in mind are, whatever your problems are, they are many and varied, and they don't all have one common cause. And your focus of attention is limited. So if you just have lots of different parts that are not very coordinated, and your focus of attention is limited, self-reform has to be of the following form. You pick one thing, you look at it carefully, you ask, how could I do this better? You start to do that better, you get into that habit of better, and you're enough into the habit you can look elsewhere and expect to keep going. And then look elsewhere and repeat. You just can't expect to reform all of yourself all at once. You are too big and complicated with too many parts that aren't coordinated. That's just not going to work. If you had like one main failing, like I don't love myself enough, then you could fix that one thing and then it would all go great. And that's not how you are. You don't just have one thing that if you fix that one thing, everything will go great. You have lots of different parts. You have a body language, for example, or the way you read body language, and you could focus on how you react to skin color, but you'd have to pick that as your focus. You could say, let me over the next week watch how I react to skin color. And every time I see someone and I see a skin color, notice my reaction, and then reflect on, do I approve of this overall pattern of reaction? And if I don't, like make a plan for a change and then implement that plan and then watch the plan. How is it going? How am I doing now in reacting to skin color? And continue with your new plan until it becomes a habit, until you don't have to watch it anymore. And then you can switch to something else, although you should come back and check periodically to see whether it's slipped back, because it might, well, maybe you were wrong about what it takes for it to stick. But still, this has to be the general way you would fix things. Of course, this is how we learn anything, right? You learn to ride a bike, you learn to cook steak, whatever it is. You focus on that one thing. You ask, how am I doing? And you read about it, or you make a plan, and then you look at that one thing specifically, and then you check how it's doing on that one thing. And then after a while, you could stop looking at that one thing. And, you know, after you've made 3 steaks and they've all been good, you made them the same way. Now, next time you make a steak, you don't have to think about how do I make steaks. You just like do it the same way you did last time, and it'll maybe go fine. So in general, this is how reform would have to be personally and elsewhere. You pick some particular area and do it one at a time.
So what you're saying is that we should strive to try to automatize good behavior. Is that?
Well, almost all your behavior is automatic, I'm afraid. You don't have any choice about that. You have a limited focus of attention, and you can really only do non-automatic things in a very limited area. And that's who you are. So you have this limited spotlight. Choose where you put the spotlight, where, when, for how long. But you cannot see everything all at once. You can only see what's in your spotlight.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but if we train ourselves step by step to do those things, what they're saying is that with time they become automatic, and perhaps we don't even need to think consciously about them.
I mean, that's the key point. That is, yeah. You put a spotlight on something, and you do something while the spotlight's on, and the hope is that when the spotlight goes off, that continues. If that's not true, you fail. Then you can't permanently change things where the habit won't work. Now, there are things like that. There are things that you just can't change. You can only change temporarily while the spotlight's on, and then when the spotlight goes off, you go back. For those things, you can't change them. I'm sorry. You can only change them when the spotlight's there, and your spotlight is limited. So unless you want it to be there all the time, you're going to have to accept that you can't really change it. You know, so there are some things where we remember to put the spotlight on. You know, if I'm ever standing in front of a crowd and giving a speech, you know, don't scratch my butt. You might just try to remember that, right? And you try to set up these cues where it's like, uh-oh, I'm scratching my butt. Don't do that, right? And so one way to be automatic is just to set these warning flags. And that's part of what we do automatically. We automatically set warning flags, which are just little habit of noticing a thing in a context such that we could then respond a certain way. That's part of what it means to be automatic. Part of automaticity is automatically turning the spotlight onto certain things in certain ways.
Mm-hmm. And when looking at ways to trying to improve society at large, would you say that we should focus on individual change or collective change? That is, for example, if, let's say, a person with this new knowledge bit by bit tries to improve his or her own behavior, but then she is inserted into a society where the circumstances don't really allow for that better behavior to express itself in an easy way. So I don't know if you...
Well, so I mean, yes, I mean, our levers of change are mostly collective in either norms or institutions.
Yeah.
So if you want to get people to change behavior, you need to create a new norm, and a new norm has to be enforceable. Mm-hmm. And then people can implement the new norm. That is, if they see somebody violating the norm, they can point it out and you know, help them fix it. Yeah. And that's how we collectively change our behavior, is through new norms and through new institutions, a new voting institution or a new piece of software. That's how we can make changes. What I've learned, though, is that it's actually easier to figure out how to do things better than it is to get people to care. I could figure out a new norm that would make the world better. I could figure out a new software app that would make the world better. I could figure out a new political voting rule that would make the world better. With time, I mean, it's not easy, but I've studied this enough, and enough other people have studied, that we actually know a lot of ways that the world could be better. The hard part is to get anyone to care. How do you get people to want to adopt a new norm or a new piece of software, etc., and to balk. That's the hardest part, because again, it's about our motives with respect to reform. So we have talking about hidden motives and real motives and the apparent motives. When we talk about social reform, we talk usually as if we all agree that we have the motive that we want to adopt better reforms. That's, of course, what we want to do. That's why we're talking about possible reforms, is because if we found a reform that we liked, we would, of course, work together to adopt it. And that's just not true. People all the time are informed and know about ways to make things better, and they don't do anything. They don't want to do anything. So our actual motives with respect to reform are more plausibly, you want to sound like you're a caring, good person. If you can show, a caring, good person would care about what reforms could make the world better. So, of course, often we are complaining about the world, and we're complaining about behavior in the world, and often we're doing this to show our moral superiority or our high moral standards. We find that comforting and nice. We're fine with complaining about how things are, because that shows that we don't accept how things are. Therefore, we are disappointed by how things are because we are better than that. And the implication, of course, is that we would want to make things better, and we often, of course, get trapped into saying or presuming that, yes, we're complaining, and therefore we would, of course, try to make things better. And we do often talk about how things could be made better, but we are not at all very practical about that. So, for example, when we elect politicians, I think we mentioned this in the book, we like politicians who take our positions we can identify with. They are for this and are against that. But we actually don't want politicians much who are good at making change happen. Politicians who are good at working behind the scenes and making deals and working with agencies and working out all the practicalities to make things happen, because we don't actually want the changes. We just want the position of being in favor of the changes. So, and there's a lot of institutional changes people have long known should make things better, but people are not very interested in them, often because they don't have a political polarization projection. That is, they aren't left versus right. So, for example, we have voting rules like approval voting, and people study that say, yeah, approval voting should help, but it's not a left versus right issue, so people just don't care very much. People love to show that if they're on the left, I'm pro this left thing, I'm anti that right thing. If they're on the right, they do the opposite. People love to take up the political fight and show they're on their side of the fight and they're loyal to their side of the fight. But as soon as you have a reform that isn't on one side or the other of the usual political fight, people have almost no interest. It just makes everybody better off. But what's so interesting about that? That's not being loyal to your side. That's just helping everybody.
Yes, and it also has a lot to do with the social, political, economic, and so on. I mean, the environment, the stability of the environment people live in. So, for example, if the environment is too unstable, I mean, the instincts very easily kick in, and so it's very difficult to convince people to try to operate under better parameters.
I mean, when things are changing a lot, it's hard to figure out what a better institution would be. But for an awful lot of our institutions, things haven't been changing that much. And we have been able to study them and figure out what would make better. But again, people don't care. Like I talked before about school and learning the material. Again, we've known lots of ways to help schools learn the material. Yes, schools are changing somewhat. Yes, there's more computers, less, Latin. But that doesn't really affect much whether we should adopt these ways to learn the material faster. They would work better for computers just like they would work better for Latin. The fact that we're moving from Latin to computers isn't the reason why we're not adopting all these better ways to learn the material faster. I would say it's because we know at some level we don't want to learn more material. That's not why we're at school. And similarly, in many of these other reform areas, the key limitation, I would say, is that we kind of know that we don't want the thing we're pretending to want. And so we're not very motivated by a reform that would... So, for example, approval voting would produce better policies. We don't want better policies. We want to show that we're loyal to our side. Yay us, boo them. Approval voting doesn't help with that, so why do we want it? And again, overall, we know ways we could organize medicine better to give more effective medicine. We're not interested because we're not using medicine to make us healthier. We're using it to show we care, and these reforms won't let us show we care more.
Yeah, and that's why I posed the question about the individual versus collective approaches, because I mean, it's still very difficult for people to, when talking about their social domain, their social realm, for them to change a lot of their hidden motives if they go along with what people around them are doing, because it can even turn into a question of survival, right?
I think it might be more about coordinating with your audiences about your signals, about your showing off. So for example, say I realize we're spending a lot on medicine and it's not helping very much, and I say, well, let's just cut back on medicine. Well, if I'm a CEO or a family head and I want to just cut back on spending less on medicine, I'm concerned the rest of my family or my employees will think I don't care about them. And so I might say, well, I'm going to show you that I'm going to take this money from medicine and I'm going to spend it on something else you want in order to convince you that I do care about you. I'm just trying to help you more. But even then, even if I get me and my family to agree that medicine isn't very useful and that we're going to spend the money in other ways, we're worried about how it looks to other people elsewhere. What if they hear that, you know, my wife is sick and I just told her to lie in bed, and I said, did she go to the doctor? I said, oh no, doctors aren't any good, so don't send her there, and they think I don't care. And so it's more about this larger equilibrium. You can change your behavior if you're willing to accept the different interpretations people will make of you and your behavior. So you could say, well, I don't learn much in college. College is expensive. Why don't I just start a business and do something else? And now the problem is later on somebody will say, what, you don't have a college degree? And they'll think you're an idiot, or they won't think you're very capable, right? And so now you have to worry about what they'll think of you. And so for a lot of these things, the limitation is in this wider world of perceptions. But sometimes you can decide, well, I don't care about those anymore. So for example, you might be 50-year-old, say, and you say, it's kind of late for me to get a college degree. People have already made their opinions about how smart I am, etc. And that just won't help anymore. So, I mean, so some people, even at the age of 50, they think, I'm going to finally show everybody I have a college degree and I know something. Because they've always felt bad their whole life that people have been looking down to them, and now they're going to prove themselves. But, you know, again, the more you think about, well, what are you showing to who, the more you could work through and say, well, I don't really need to show that now. Right? Things you might do to convince a potential mate, somebody to marry you once you're married and you're not planning to remarry, you might think, don't need to do those anymore. Right?
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, it's perhaps at least a little bit understandable that when people try to make decisions that would affect them in the long run, I mean, sometimes they can get into a situation where they have to decide that either they change their that particular aspect of their behavior and sacrifice a little bit their social prospects, let's say, or otherwise, right?
Right now, I mean, clearly in the modern world, many people make a choice to seem weird to other people in order to gain some specialty advantages, right? Some people become undertakers, right? Now, for most people, dealing with dead bodies is icky, and somebody who is really comfortable with that, well, they're kind of icky too, right? Mm-hmm. But you could overcome that because, well, you're going to be an undertaker, and that's going to be your thing. And people might come to respect that for you because, yes, all else equal, somebody who was not bothered by being around dead bodies would be kind of suspicious. Because you've made this your thing and you've become good at it and you are recognized for it, well, maybe they will not be concerned about that. They will say, well, I guess you have to be some sort of odd person to be an undertaker, but he's a good undertaker and he's a conscientious one and he's very effective and I'm glad to recommend him. And that you might be okay with that slot in your life, right? So for myself, for example, obviously my being willing to talk about the things in our book makes me kind of odd, right? Most people who would bring this up at a party, you might go, they're kind of cynical, they're kind of negative, and that it might be just kind of a negative sign about somebody to be so cynical about so many things. But if I make it my specialty, I'm saying, I'm not just a generic cynical guy in the bar bitching about things. I wrote a book on it. and people respect it, and I'm a world expert on this stuff. This is my thing. And you can see from my personality, I'm not low and mean and in a low mood and gripey and complainy. I'm a bright and optimistic guy and friendly. I'm just like talking about these important questions, and yeah, the conclusions I've drawn are kind of cynical, but that's the way the dice roll, and that's how I got to call it. And you know, you can make that a virtue out of it, right? So because we can be different and specialize, you could find yourself a niche in the world where you can, you know, violate some of these typical behaviors and get away with it.
Yeah, and I was going to talk about that, the fact that isn't it true that if we follow along those lines, as you were saying, that we could get into a position that was too niche when we're talking about perhaps social change?
You mean personally?
I mean, perhaps I was thinking more along the lines of, yes, you're trying to improve yourself in this way and that way, and then to perhaps start with you and try to change people in a larger scale. That means at a societal, collective scale. But perhaps if you get too weird, let's say, you get into a niche, and then you're stuck with that.
Well, there's a trade-off in trying to influence a small community or a larger community.
Yeah.
One strategy is to try to find a small... So as an intellectual, I can say, look, the kind of things I talk about and the way they talk about would put most people off. But I'm just going to find a world of intellectuals, and we're going to create a norm within our world that it's okay to talk about these things that way. And then I can enjoy being in that world and talking that way. Of course, if that world disappeared, if I were forced to leave that world, I would pay a cost with respect to a larger world. So anytime you specialize in a particular part of the world, you are at risk for that world disappearing or throwing you out, that you'll then have to deal with other people. But you know, often it might seem that you have a good enough chance of staying there that it's worth that. And of course, if you were trying to change everybody, a first step might be to create a community where that was changed, but then you might ask, well, now how can I move from that to a larger thing? And that maybe the experience of how that worked in the community would give a lot of interesting information and insight into how it might then work on a larger scale, but that wouldn't be enough. You'd then have to think about how to move farther. So if we take the Undertaker example, right? If there's an accusation that there's a vampire in the village, well, the Undertaker is going to be suspected of being the vampire, right? Because he's just like, he fits that scenario. So he's got to accept that if there's an accusation of some weird guy doing weird things, it might be the Undertaker, because the Undertaker's kind of weird, especially with respect to death. Weird things related to death, it might be the Undertaker. And you know, and similarly, if there's, you know, a concern about somebody who's especially cynical, and we economists are thought of being cynical, so they're going to look at you and say, aha, you must be the fault because you're the cynics. There you are. And so, you know, that's just a general cost of being a specialist in a sense. You get the reputation and the associations of specialist, and some of those aren't always positive.
Mm-hmm. But couldn't it also happen that perhaps the people that get along with you are the ones that share some specific traits with you? For example, they have similar personalities, they share a similar ideology, and then you create that community that starts to get a little bit insular and
of course
never really gets to extend beyond its boundaries.
Sure, although that might be okay with you. You know, I mean, you know, we're always at risk of losing our small community, so we want to retain some robustness and ability to function in other communities. But the more likely we are to stay in our community, the more we might mostly invest in that community and not worry about what happens if I had to leave, because we don't think we'll have to leave. And that happens all the time too. So you have to make a choice about how general or specialized to be in some ways. And I think about that myself because I want to specialize to being an intellectual. But I don't want to specialize to being an intellectual who's an economist or a physicist or a psychologist or somebody who represents the West. I want to try to be a universal intellectual, somebody who could see things from the point of view of people 1,000 years ago or 1,000 years in the future, somebody who could see things from the point of view of humanities or sciences, I want to sort of encompass a wide range of intellectual perspectives and not specialize too much. But I want to be an intellectual. I'm fine with that. I've given up on being a musician. I'm not going to specialize as a musician. I'm not going to have the attitudes or styles of a musician. And if somehow the only job available were me being a musician, that's not going to go well for me. But I think that's pretty unlikely, so I'm not going to worry about it.
Mm-hmm. And what would you say are, perhaps in social terms, the risks and advantages of the social world we move in nowadays, in the sense that nowadays it's much more difficult to people to live in the same place throughout their lives. They move quite a lot, and so on the one hand, I mean, it's very difficult for people that move a lot and that change jobs and places a lot to keep perhaps a sense of community. But on the other end, and thanks the other end, thanks perhaps to things like the internet, it's pretty easy nowadays for you to identify, to have a certain identity, and when you move to a new place, to very easily find people that live there that share the same interests as you. So, I mean,
obviously, different kinds of lifestyles require different adaptations and different habits of life and behavior. Mm-hmm. The biggest obvious risk to pay attention to is that we humans might just have certain expectations and habits based on our ancient human environments that no longer apply to the world today.
Yeah.
So for example, it seems to me that in the United States, in high school, people are in the habit of caring an enormous amount about their friends and associates.
Yeah.
And that made sense for their ancestors because they would basically be dealing with those people for the rest of their lives. So it made a lot of sense as a kid to start to form the relationships and impressions that would matter for the rest of your life. If people think of you as a nerd in high school, they're going to think of you for the rest of your life. If they think of you as unreliable, they might think of you that way for the rest of your life. If you form friendships, you might keep them for the rest of your life. And then people in high school in the United States do seem to put an enormous amount of attention and energy into their reputation and their friendships in high school. But of course, in our world, most people, or even many people, leave their high school town and never come back. And they'll never deal with those people for the rest of their life. And all that energy is wasted because they'll be going to a college, then going off to a city, and then having a whole new set of associates and partners. The things they learn from those relationships will be things they could then transfer to new relationships in their lives, but the specific relationships will just be lost. Mm-hmm. And it seems like their habits don't get that. Their intuitive habit of just paying a lot of attention to their popularity and who likes them and who they know doesn't get that this is just practice, and it'll mostly be thrown away. And so that's one of the many habits. So obviously another thing is just that in large cities we seem to be nice to people and trustworthy in ways that are never going to pay off. In a small town, if you're not nice to people or trustworthy, the word gets back and that hurts you. And in a big city, you could be untrustworthy or rude to somebody who's a stranger on the street, and it'll never get back to you probably. Now, in big cities, people are ruder and less trustworthy to people they meet on the street, but still, it doesn't seem like their habits really get how much freedom they have and how far away from the small town world they are. And so again, these are things humans are learning, and the key question, of course, is how long these changes will last. So these new environments, if they don't last long enough, then we won't adapt to them, and then we will just bounce around. Our behavior will sit in somewhere in the middle of the range of environments we'll experience. Mm-hmm. And that's, of course, related to the topic of my first book, The Age of M, which we haven't talked about, where I try to imagine this very different future world and try to imagine how behavior would adapt to that world. And it is very different, and a lot of things are new and strange. And part of the fun is to really think through how would behavior be different in this world, because I do think in this world behavior would adapt to it. That is, there's enough incentive and time and selection for behavior to adapt to this new, different world, even more so than it has happened in our world. And so that's the question: how would they behave different in a strange new world?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And wouldn't you say that at least it happened at a global scale with the introduction of capitalism and globalism, that one of the ways, at least in the political realm, people's mentality changed, politicians' mentality changed, was the fact that because they started to, countries started to trade much more among themselves, that it would be much more profitable to them, instead of starting a war with a neighboring country or something like that, to keep to keep people from that country alive, because then they would have the goods from that country and so on. And so, would you say that perhaps that at the level of big cities could also be happening with individuals when, for example, they go to the bakery or a place like that, and even if they don't know the baker, they have much more to profit from not treating him badly, because, I mean, he bakes the cake.
I mean, if you're going to have repeated interactions with the baker, then it makes more sense how you treat them and how they treat you. If you, in a tourist spot, let's say, you know, and you're never going to be there again, then it's much more of a question, like, why tip the waiter at a place you'll never come back to again? You know, if you come back there regularly, it makes sense to tip the waiter to give them a sense of what you like and don't like, and to make sure they pay attention to you. But tipping once in a place you're never coming back to again is more of a puzzle. I'm very interested and talk a bit in the last book about the major changes in attitudes and behaviors over the last few centuries, and certainly some behavior changes are due to adaptation to our new world. That is, because the world has changed, our behavior has changed because it makes more sense in this new world. But I think there's a bunch of other behaviors that have changed substantially over the last few centuries that can't really attribute it to that explanation. And I'm puzzled over that. And my story is that we are drifting back toward forager attitudes on many non-work things. We started out as foragers, and we stayed as foragers, and then farming became possible, but it was only possible because we used a lot of social pressure and conformity and self-control to make ourselves have new, very different norms and attitudes that were functional in the farming world. And now in the last few centuries, we've been getting rich, and the social pressures that turned us into farmers are less compelling when we're rich, and we're more asking ourselves, what does our forager heart want? And it's telling us different things, and we're more listening to that because we're less constrained by being poor to have to do what works around us, and we can just do what we want because we're rich. And so I think this explains a lot of major trends over the last few centuries, including more democracy, less slavery, more travel, more leisure, more promiscuity, more art, you know, more product variety. I think a lot of the major trends are not because we've adapted to this world, except adapting to being rich, in the sense of not going back to forager attitudes, because in some sense farmers were always repressed foragers who had enough self-control and discipline to do what they needed to do to survive in their world and to see it as an ideal. But we're constantly tempted to become more forager-like, and having to repress that, and sometimes failing and sometimes suffering because of that.
Mm-hmm. And don't you think that perhaps another big reason why those changes happened was because capitalism allowed for a real, enduring economic growth over time that was historically in person?
Well, that's what caused the wealth that caused the attitude change. So that would be, of course, yes, of course. The major feature of the last few centuries is we've been able to grow wealth faster than we grow people. So the wealth per person has grown. And then we've had all these attitude changes, and the question is, what's the cause of those attitude changes? And I'd say primarily the cause is wealth. Yeah. Wealth making us feel more inclined to be forager-like, specifically. And as more forager-like people, at least when we're not at work, because we're actually kind of hyper-farmers at work, but once we leave the work door, we're more forager-like, and so we have more forager values and attitudes. And that, I think, explains a lot of the major attitude changes over the last few centuries. But that's not because they're more functional. Ours is not a more forager-like world, per se. It's just we like to be more forager-like, personally.
Mm-hmm.
That's
okay. Yeah?
That's perfect. That's it.
Okay. So Dr. Hanson, I guess I don't have any other questions for you today, so perhaps we will end it there. We're also almost hitting 3 hours now. So
all right.
So just before we finish this, would you like perhaps to share with people, I don't know if you're working on a new book or not, and share with people where they can find your work on the internet and on social media and things like that?
Well, that last question is the easiest to answer. So generally I'm hanson.gmu.edu. That's where most of my writings and things like that. I have a blog called Overcoming Bias. I'm on Twitter at Robin Hanson and also on Facebook. I have these 2 recent books, which can be found at websites. One is ageofm.com. and the other is elephantinthebrain.com. Those are for my 2 books. The second book is co-authored with Kevin Simler. Yeah. You know, I have other things I'm working on now, although I'm not sure how much I want to say in a short time about, I mean, you know, we can go into a longer discussion, but I have this research project I've been working on, a grant from Open Philanthropy, where I've been working on a different future scenario, not the one in Age of M, but a related one where there's a different route to artificial intelligence. And I've been trying to explore that scenario and have some interesting things to say. But again, we don't really have time to get into that here. And I'd be interested in pursuing the topics in Elephant in the Brain if other people are interested in pursuing them. And I guess we will see, like I said, I think there's still a great potential here to look at hidden motives in a lot of other areas. The question is, how interested is the world in that? And so I'm very opportunistic about my research in the sense that I think there's lots of interesting topics, but I look at things that are neglected and important, where I think, you know, simple methods can produce a lot of results. And both of my books have been like that. And I will just continue to look for things like that in the future. But of course, part of the thing is, if I make a contribution to something, will anyone care? And that's harder to judge. Again, you have these naive assumptions about what people should care about, but then you find out what they do care about, and it's often quite different. And so I'm still, perhaps the thing I'm most stuck on or puzzled by is, if I work on a particular area that I think is important and neglected and I can make progress on, will anyone care?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, so perhaps in the future we could have a second interview to talk about those other topics that are of interest to you. But
I'm happy to, but yeah, I've got a lot more things I could talk about than in one interview, but happy to talk to you again sometime if you like.
Okay, great. So Dr. Hanson, again, I would really like to thank you for taking a bit of your time to being here with us today, and it was a real pleasure to talk to you.
Thanks for talking to me. Take care.
Okay, take care. Hi everybody, thank you for coming to my channel and for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've started this channel last February and have been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. To keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge. Any amount, even $1, would already be a great help. Otherwise, if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons, KARIN, LIETZCKE and Blanchette. Thank you for all.